Hungary and Poland lose their case against the EU. The European Court of Justice rules the bloc can withhold billions in funding from members that don't respect the EU rule of law. Hungary and Poland call it blackmail. But will it bring the far right back into line with Brussels? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the clash with the EU's right-wing rulers. So if you want EU funding, you need to adhere to EU values. That was the verdict in the European Court of Justice on Wednesday when it ruled against an appeal by Hungary and Poland. The two had challenged the bloc's right to suspend EU payments if standards of democracy and justice were not adequately met. It's known as the conditionality mechanism, meaning member states can't discard core EU principles after joining the group while still expecting the benefits of membership, especially the monetary ones. Now, there have been concerns that the governments in Warsaw and Budapest have been undermining the rule of law, an independent media and judicial system, and curtailing political opposition. But Poland, which gets more EU money than any other state, says Brussels is abusing its power.
We are very concerned about the fact that EU institutions are giving themselves more and more responsibilities. Today's ruling, being just another in a series, is just another chapter in this book.
Well, Hungary was equally outraged, with the ruling Fidesz party arguing Brussels is trying to impose values that don't fit their conservative, predominantly Catholic society. The government interpreted the court's decision as an attempt to cancel its planned legislation to prevent schools from teaching about homosexuality and transgender issues.
The European Court of Justice made a political decision because of our upcoming referendum on child protection. It didn't come as a surprise for us, as the president of the court had earlier hinted at what kind of verdict we could expect.
Well, the ruling was celebrated by civil society groups and liberal lawmakers who are now urging the European Commission to use their newfound legal power.
I sincerely hope that this day will mark the end of the procrastination from the side of the Commission. I sincerely hope that today will be the day where the Commission realizes its historic duty and will take on its role as the guardian of the treaties and start to implement existing EU legislation. Because, colleagues, this legislation is union law since more than a year, and the Commission was waiting around to look for excuses, to look for delays, and thus, in the meantime, the rule of law was destroyed further in Hungary and in Poland, and also other member states might have had the idea that in this union they could do anything without any serious repercussions. This has to stop now.
But if politically progressive Europeans are hoping this will end the culture war with the right, they may have to think again. The leaders of Hungary and Poland are not alone in their views. In fact, several far-right parties across Europe launched a concerted effort last year to create a continent-wide alliance. They intend to form a far-right supergroup within the European Parliament that could potentially sway the direction of the Union itself. In January, the group held a summit in Madrid organized by Spain's Vox party. The attendees were a who's who of Europe's nationalist and populist politicians, including Hungary's Viktor Orbán and his Polish counterpart, as well as French presidential candidate Marine Le Pen. They denounced what they called a Europe governed by a self-appointed elite, which, quote, pursues an arbitrary application of European law. Now, we reached out to members of Poland and Hungary's ruling parties, inviting them to take part in this discussion. However, they declined. So we are joined today from Warsaw by Rafal Pankowski. He is a professor at the Institute of Sociology at Collegium Civitas and co-founder of the anti-racist campaign group, the Never Again Association. From Liverpool is Francesco Rizzuto. He is a professor of European law and the dean of the Liverpool Hope University's Law School. And in Oxford is Roger Griffin, professor of modern history at Oxford Brookes University and an expert on European fascism and far-right movements. Thanks all so much for being with us. Rafal, I'll start with you and tell us what you think really are going to be the repercussions of this ruling now for Hungary and Poland, because It formally declares that if you want to stay in the club, you have to follow the rules, and neither country, under their current leadership, wants to do that.
Well, I agree, it is an important moment, but at the same time, I think there is a much bigger issue at stake, the bigger picture, which is the crisis of the whole paradigm, the whole model, if you like, of democratic transformation in Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, Poland and Hungary are two main examples of that. But this is not just about a legal difference of opinion between the Polish authorities and the European Union institutions. So far, frankly speaking, the European Union has not been very effective in reacting to the so-called democratic backsliding in states such as Poland and Hungary. And I'm not sure this single ruling would be a major watershed moment in this long story of a crisis of democratic values and democratic culture in a country like Poland.
Okay. Let me ask Francesco then. I mean, Rafal seems to think that the EU has not been actually reactive to the democratic backsliding that arguably has taken place in certain Eastern European countries, not least Hungary and Poland. But would you agree with that? I mean, some would say that this ruling actually shows that the EU is doing the right thing and saying, now there will be penalties for not following our core values and our core laws.
Good afternoon. Yes, no, I agree with Rafal. I think that it's taken a number of years for the European Union to act. But even this, I mean, if we're talking about the regulation on conditionality, that was really introduced as a new mechanism, because existing mechanisms, and they are in place, Article 7 is in place, have not really been taken to their limit because of unwillingness on the part of certain member states to ensure that states that join the European Union, who then elect governments with slightly different views, actually comply with their obligations under Article 2. And I think that without a doubt, this is yet another example, if you like, of the failings of the European Union to act.
Okay, so does this ruling, in essence, have no backbone? Are there no repercussions for what it says?
If that's directed at me, I think there will be repercussions, because I think now the European Parliament in particular, which has been putting a lot of pressure on the Commission and the Council to act, for example, under Article 7, will act even more now, because of course the Parliament can now legally take the Commission to court if it's failing to act. I know we're getting into legal technicalities, but I think that this has developed a significant head of steam. And I think the Commission itself is aware of the fact that taking infringement proceedings against Poland or Hungary hasn't really worked. These states have simply ignored the rulings of the court. So let's go for the pocket now. But it will still require the Council to agree in the end.
Okay, so Roger, what's your outlook then for the implementation, really, of this ruling? Will Hungary and Poland have to change now, or at least make some very serious decisions?
Well, I'm going to watch the situation with interest. I can't predict what's going to happen, but there are some deeply unresolved issues, as has been alluded to by the other speakers. At the heart of the EU, there's a big confusion ideologically over what we mean by democracy. And there has never been a direct confrontation with the problem of what happens when illiberal ideas about society gain a democratic majority. That is a tension which happened at a very large scale in America under Trump, and it's going to be faced by France in the elections quite soon, because there has been a tendency to equate democracy with liberal democracy, whereas in fact the connection between the two is historically a very slow and complicated one. And what is happening in many countries now is that we have constitutional democracies where the liberal, pluralistic, tolerant spirit of liberal democracy is being eroded or destroyed. So I see a much bigger issue at the heart of all this, which is actually part of a world process by which liberalism gradually gets, or quite suddenly gets, separated from democracy as a constitutional system.
Okay, just quickly though, I mean, some have said that this kind of wave of right-wing momentum across Europe, not least in the UK, where you are, is somewhat receding at this point. Roger, do you not see that happening?
Well, I'd really like to come in here and say that there is a massive amount of confusion about the word right here. I mean, I see that you've put up on the screens Europe's far right fight. Well, that we have to have quite a big spectrum analysis here. I mean, the original attempt to promote Brexit could be represented by a wide spectrum of positions, from a simple anti-EU sovereignty position represented by the, if you like, the far left of the Brexit movement, right over to forms of racism and not quite fascism, but certainly extreme nationalism. And I'm afraid the word far right, we need to really drill into that. I would actually say that we must break down this phrase far right into its various constituencies.
Okay.
I find the deliberalization of democracy and, for example, the rise of neo-Nazi or far-right parties, they're related, but they're actually quite different issues.
Okay. Maybe we can talk more about that in a minute, but let me go back to Rafal, because I want to talk about this ruling, and specifically Hungary and Poland, and what they want. Some had said they are really just trying to have it both ways, to stay in the EU, but to be able to change it, you know, from the inside out, and that to push for more federalism so that the EU learns to respect its various nations' sovereignties and their independent decisions according to the laws that they see fit. So do you think Poland and Hungary, if that is the case, will keep trying to work along those lines and keep trying to push to change the EU from within for a more federalist-like structure, rather than following rulings like the one we've seen at the European Court of Justice today?
Well, I would say that one of the paradoxes in Poland, and I believe to some extent in Hungary too, is that the ruling party is sort of Eurosceptic, but Polish society remains one of the most pro-European societies in the whole of the European Union. So at least for that reason, the ruling party is not prone to saying we want to leave the union, but well, certainly they are in a very bitter conflict over some very basic values of the European Union, and I think, well, alluding to what Roger said about the term far right, I think it's interesting in the case of the Polish ruling party, Law and Justice, how it is perceived or labeled. Is the far right label accurate or not? And I think what's important to note here is that the Law and Justice Party has evolved over the years. When it started in the early 2000s, it was a center-right party that was in the Christian Democratic group in the European Parliament, later in the group with the British Conservatives. But over the years, it moved to the right, and nowadays it cooperates with the movements, the political parties in the West, known for a long time as far-right parties. I'm talking about the Le Pen party or the League in Italy.
Okay. Francesco, let me turn to you, because on this question of, Poland and Hungary still wanting to try and have it both ways, I mean, we do have to remember, according to polls at least, that their publics are very much in favor of staying in the EU, but again, they would like to see a different EU where they don't interpret Brussels as abusing its power by imposing its laws on its member states. So at some point, first of all, how far do you think Hungary and Poland will go, to keep trying to make those changes? And will eventually the EU have to contend with that at some point and perhaps concede on some laws?
Well, I think it's important for us not to confuse a state being a member of the European Union and a government that, if you like, is a custodian of a state for a period of time. There are elections coming up in Hungary in the next few weeks, and there might be a change there, just as there are elections in Poland, and there might be changes. And I think that explains why Brussels and certain capitals in the European Union have been reticent about suspending a state, even though they don't like the government. So it's important to bear that in mind. As far as Poland is concerned, if I adopt, if you like, a legalistic approach to this, look, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal has issued two judgments that are absolutely scandalous. And I don't want to take issue with Professor Griffin, but I really think that you can't remain in a club if your constitutional court basically says that the European Convention on Human Rights is contrary to certain parts of the Polish constitution on the rule of law and the right to a fair trial. And the Constitutional Tribunal also says that the EU treaties are contrary to the Polish constitution. I suggest that one or two lawyers advising the Constitutional Tribunal read their constitution, particularly Article 90, 91, and 92. But I don't want to be legalistic about it. No, ultimately, the ruling yesterday clarifies certain things. That the European Union is not a dictatorship, that we're pretty clear what we mean by constitutional government that abides by the rule of law. We are also pretty clear about what it means when a state joins the European Union and the values they must fulfill.
But Francesco, are they joining for those values, or do they just actually want the funding and investment that they can get out of it and think that they can manipulate the values once they're in?
I think you're absolutely right. But again, like the tide, it comes in and out. The governments that are governing those states at the present time adopt the view that they want to try and get it both ways. However, I don't think they will have it both ways. Ignoring the law is one thing. Not being given the funds in order to keep yourself in power is another. And this is the political strategy here is, without getting into the ideology of in, out, and all about and so on. So I think that this ruling is yet another nail in, I won't say the coffin, because I don't mean to be horrid in that way, but it is another nail, if you like, in the barricade that is being put up against states that clearly are introducing rules, for example, on the organization of the judiciary, or rules on minorities and so on, that clearly infringe the values of Article 2. And whilst, Professor Griffin talks about this debate about democracy, actually, a democracy can be an authoritarian democracy, a democracy that doesn't respect rights and limits, legal limits to what a government can do, clearly has a problem in the European Union.
Okay, Francesco, very quickly, I mean, how badly does the EU need members like Poland and Hungary?
You're talking to somebody who was basically very reticent about the political justifications for enlargement eastwards. Not because I don't believe they shouldn't become parts of the European Union, but I agreed with the former Italian foreign minister who believed in a European Union of concentric circles and different kinds of memberships. They took an opposite decision, and I think we're dealing with the consequences now. I really think that there will be crunch time if there isn't political change in these countries as to whether they will have their voting rights suspended if they persist down that line.
Okay, because Roger, let me ask you, I mean, how badly does the EU project itself suffer damage, including to its own image, when, its members like Hungary and Poland challenge the institution like this?
Well, it depends what you conceive to be the overall ethos of the EU. There is a very idealistic vision of the EU as a confederation or a loose alliance of countries dedicated to liberal democratic principles, and there's a very humanitarian and humanistic interpretation of that. But I'm afraid there is also, running alongside that, a far more, if you like, materialistic vision of it as a club of developed nations. And I think that it, unfortunately, until yesterday, it has been possible for a country like Hungary to take a lot of the economic advantages of being part of the EU while actually ignoring that idealistic, humanistic ethos, anti-totalitarian and anti-racist. And I'm afraid up till recently, I've been in despair about the failure of the EU to actually use its economic and legal power to actually rein in these nations. So I'm hoping, though I hope I'm not naive, that this is a turning point, and that finally the humanistic vision of the EU will start presiding over the economic and political alliance aspect of the EU.
Okay, Rafal, let me ask you, I mean, if it is a turning point, do you see this ruling playing any role in the elections going forward, you know, primarily in Hungary, a crucial one is coming up, but also in Poland?
Well, let's not forget that both in Poland and in Hungary, the ruling parties have competition not only from the center and the left, but they also have competition further to the right. There are extreme right political movements and political parties which are even more nationalistic and even more anti-European in their outlook. And that also plays a certain role in terms of its impact on the actual policy.
Absolutely.
So I think that's one thing to note. And if I may just slightly disagree with the other speakers on the term illiberal democracy. I know it has been used a lot in the last years in discussions about Poland and Hungary as well as Brazil and other countries. But I think in a way it might be a contradiction in terms. It might be an oxymoron. Because at the end of the day, you know, the way I like to imagine democracy, it is not just majority rule, but it is also the protection of minorities. And I think that one of the really important aspects and one of the really problematic aspects of the current situation, both in Poland and in Hungary, is this pattern of vilification of minorities as a as a mechanism of political mobilization. Different minorities. It can be Jews, it can be refugees, LGBT, and I think this is not talked about enough.
Right.
But as a member of the Never Again Association, I can tell you that in the last 7 years we have seen a big rise in both hate speech and hate crime attacks.
Indeed. Let me ask you. Francesco, I could hear you agreed with a lot of what Rafal was saying. I mean, how much is the EU really still struggling with the divides, you know, created over how to manage migrants and refugees? You know, starting back in 2015, it really highlighted the gulf between the opinions of people in certain countries versus others. Are we still paying for that today in the EU?
I think to an extent, though, well, we saw what happened during the months of the Belarus crisis to an extent, and the consequences of that. So it's there, but I think what that refugee crisis really demonstrated was the fundamental difference between certain parts of the Union and others, and actually the remarkably discriminatory approach taken by what I would describe as newcomers to the European project, who were claiming to be saving European Christendom and civilization. Which is extraordinary. I think it's still there, and I think there's a lot of unease in certain Western European societies that you know, actually Poland and Hungary, Poland in particular, have not played the game of European solidarity at all, but they're giving lessons to others, and yet they want the contribution of taxpayers from other countries. So there's a problem there. Can I just say something in agreement with Rafal? I think it's, I started my life as a political scientist. Political sociologist, political scientist theory. And then I lapsed into the world of the law. I call it a lapse. But however,
We've got 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Very, very important. I prefer to talk about limited constitutional democracy, limited by law that protects rights, because a democracy doesn't guarantee you the protection of rights. It can guarantee you a government that claims that because it has a mandate, it can ignore the rights and the limitation of rights that it inflicts on others. So it's important. And I think that's what's happening in Poland, and that's what's happened in Hungary.
Okay, Francesco, you will have to have the final word because unfortunately we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.